All right, good morning, everybody. Let me start this meeting more formally and welcome you very warmly to this Wednesday morning here, and actually with some sunshine, and some of you probably still feeling a bit hungover from the night of watching the US election unfold. So if I see some very tired faces, I fully understand. I think there's some records around the table here when people went to bed, but no decision yet. It's tempting to go there, but I think we're going to draw our attention to a different subject this morning. I would start this session here by telling you this, that Geoff Bird, whom we're going to introduce in a second, is very interested in connecting with the center and with some of you. And we thought for Geoff to come in and present his research would be a good way of introducing himself. Although it's, it would be so much preferred to have him in a room and really, present, the research networks and communities that we have at the center. But for the time being, I think this online forum will have to suffice, and we will hopefully be able to introduce Geoff more fully into our circle, once things open up. Before I introduce Geoff, and thank you, Geoff, for doing this in such short-term notice. Geoff jumped into the opportunity to present on, from one week to the other, so that's great. But let me briefly go through our introductory slides here. If you turn this, let me first of all recognize that with respect that we meet even virtually on the Lekwungen people's territory, on which the University of Victoria stands, and the Sangis, Esquimalt, and the Saanich peoples whose historical relationship with the land continues until today. I think talking about the past remembrance, I think, some of the insight that Geoff is going to provide, I think will be easily relatable to the legacy of colonial rule and Indigenous quest for recognition and access to the territory of their land. So very much in the spirit of this recognition here, some of what we will discuss will address some of the underlying issues. You are all pretty familiar now with the housekeeping rules. So when we present, we have the presenter having the stage. Please turn off your mics and the camera. And once we stop, please indicate that you would like to come in, raising your hands or leaving a note in the chat box so that I can call upon you to ideally start your camera and speak into the mic and raise your question. I think by now we're all familiar with the technological setup of Zoom. So, just as a reminder, these little buttons here are for sharing, for using the chat and raising your hand. Also, just to let you know, you might have seen this session is being recorded. These global talks will be made available on our website. So we have a record of these wonderful presentations that our fellows and associates have given. With this, let me present to you Geoff Bird, who is a professor at the School of Tourism and Hospitality Management at Royal Roads University. And at this institution, he has served in various roles and capacities, including the program chair and school director, and is also the creator of the War Heritage Research Initiative that speaks very much directly to what we're going to hear today. Geoff has a PhD in anthropology that he received in 2011 from the University of Brighton, in which he explored the relationship between tourism, remembrance, and landscapes of war, focusing primarily on France and Normandy. And his research also includes, and you see this here, 30 short documentary films in which he tries to address these sites of memories and the practices of commemoration that we do at those sites. And the most recent of his documentary films, as you can see here, is entitled A Moral Awakening, examining the heritage of the atomic bomb. In addition, Geoff has worked with a lot of community groups in this respect, government agencies, civil society, and community-based agencies, looking at also sustainable forms of tourism, and in a way using tourism as a way to convey memory and history linked to these sites. We thought November is the ideal month to bring in Jeff to present to us today his research. And so, Jeff, it's a real pleasure to welcome you to the Center for Global Studies. And as I said, I hope we will have a better chance to meet you and introduce you to our networks at a different stage. But for today, I would like to invite you to present your research and this way, give us a first introduction into your field of interest.
Well, thank you, Oliver. It's certainly a pleasure to be here. So I would also like to start with an acknowledgement of the land that we use at Royal Roads University, and that we are grateful to the Kwisatz and Lekwungen families who continue to share their knowledge about the history of the lands and their cultural practices. And I think you're right, Oliver. I think when I read this acknowledgement, it does, particularly when we think about remembrance, it takes me to think about my own ancestors. And I think that's where I'll start as an initial introduction into this topic today. So this is Dan Costley. In my family's history, the story goes that he walked into a recruitment center in 1915 and said, and he was told that he was asked a question, what's your age? And he says, well, I'm 16 years old. And he said, well, go around the block, come back in and tell us you're 18. And that's what he did. And that launched a journey for him where he ended up with a regiment called the Middlesex Regiment. And he went on to fight in the Battle of the Somme. And in October of 1916, he was killed at the age of 17. So for my family, as with many of you, these stories of war are passed on to us. And I think for my great uncle, Dan, and the family that he left behind, that was obviously a very traumatic time. He had two other brothers in the war who survived. His sister's husband died in the Middle East, fighting in the Middle East, and and later the daughter was killed, died in the pandemic. So the tragedy of my own ancestors is really marked by the First World War. And this was the last letter that Dan sent and was passed on in my family as part of our legacy. So for me, I was really curious when my grandmother actually told me that story for the first time. And over the years, I've made these trips to France to try to better understand what happened. And so I go to a place in the Somme called Goudricourt, and I tried to find where the regiment was and where Uncle Dan is buried. Because of course, he was like so many other soldiers of that time, buried with, killed, and there's no known grave. And so Tayyip really serves as a memorial to the missing. This massive structure, which you find just north of Albert, was built by Lutyens as an attempt to create enough wall space to cover the 70,000 men who died and who have no known grave. And so when you walk around it, you see scribed all these names in probably about 2 inches high. And there is my Dan Costley, my great uncle Dan Costley's name up on the wall. So that for me is my own act of remembrance that I engage in often when I do these presentations, where I'm thinking about my own family legacy. There's a few screens I have. I have a few computers beside me, so I'm looking at different monitors. As I was saying, and we'll just pick up the pace, and I'll just cover this very briefly here. This is the area of Somme called Goudricourt, where I often visit to see my great uncle's gravesite, which I think is his gravesite, but I really worked to try to find his location because, of course, he was one of 70,000 who were buried in this area with no known grave. So the Tayyip Memorial serves as this memorial site. It has wall space for the 70,000 names of soldiers who died and who have no known grave. So I often make my way to the Tayyip site just to make a connection with this past. And so this is a lot of what I do with my own research as I explore the visitor experience and how these sites are managed. And I'll go into a bit more detail on that. So here's what we'll cover today. I thought we'd talk about the relationship between war remembrance and the visitor experience and consider how we define terms such as remembrance and tourism, and talk about how tourism and heritage manifest themselves as a what I would call the front line of remembrance. There's been a range of different articles that have come out, and I'll speak to those in a moment. But one of the things that I thought I would do is just to state right up front what I see the relationship between remembrance, tourism, and sites of memory. So I view tourism as both an act and agent of remembrance. I'll go into this in a bit more detail. That tourism is actively involved in co-construction of meaning for people, and it's a form of what we might also call world making. And it's on the front line of the politics of remembrance. I would also say that for many people, it's a very resonant form of remembrance. It's a very transformative form of remembrance when you visit battlefields, cemeteries, or other sites of war memory. So what I've done is I've created a collaborate space for us to share ideas. And you can go to this site as we're walking through. And I did share the link earlier. And Stephanie, would you mind if you share that with everyone? I think you're probably familiar with Padlet. There's a little button down in the lower right-hand corner, and you can post as you're going along, and perhaps we can use this as part of our discussion later on. So there's a range of publications that have come out recently that explore war memory and remembrance. And I'm just going to offer a few examples because the title of my work today is around the interdisciplinarity of remembrance. And a lot of these are written by historians that we know well. And what I find intriguing is that these are often written for the public. And so it's a topic that is popular in the general public. And two that are just recently out are Margaret Macmillan's book on war, how conflict shaped us, and Tim Cook's book that looks at what he calls the fight for history, which is about the Second World War and Canada's effort to remember and the issues around forgetting and silencing. So in addition to kind of the typical historical perspective, which is certainly very valuable, we see a number of other scholars who are stepping in and exploring this. We have various areas of the social sciences that come into play. And I've just put a few here just to offer kind of a wide range of voices that are bringing into perspective different issues related to remembrance, commemoration, and war memory. And what we can see when we look at these is we can see issues around general philosophical trends, or we can see issues around how sites are managed. We can see about even just at the very personal experience of the tourist who goes to these sites. So I'm at Royal Roads University, and I hope you've had a chance to visit the grounds. It's a very beautiful setting that we're in there. And I've had the opportunity since about 2015 to create a site called the War Heritage Research Initiative, which received some funding back in 2015 to create a series of short films. And it was interesting because when I talked to Commemoration Canada, and we started to move towards this idea of doing some documentaries, they said, okay, and you can't go overseas. You have to focus on Canadian sites of memory, but you can't go overseas. And when we think about war, often Canada's experience is overseas. So a lot of our war heritage sites are in France, Italy, Hong Kong, Belgium, Holland. And so, so the challenge was to come up with a list of sites of war memory in Canada that have a story to be told. And I started with 22 and I ended up with 30, and now I have about 33. And we divided these across First and Second World War sites. And really, the list goes on and on. We can think about a range of sites if we extend ourselves in terms of the definition we use for site of war memory. I've worked at the Bayou Ranch, where Percheron horses were sold and or reared and sold for the First World War, sent over to the war. That's in Alberta. There's the arsenal in Quebec City, where women were basically working in the ammunition factories there. And it was the largest Commonwealth ammunitions factory in the world. Chinese Labor Corps up at Machosa. We know that at William Head, that they came ashore there at the quarantine station. So there's all kinds of different stories that we can explore when we get into war memory. And so I invite you to visit the site and to look at the range of stories that we have there. I've also been involved with a range of projects working with different agencies to look at how we can engage in mediating the experience of visitors when they go to sites. An example of this is at Dachau, where community guides who are associated with local charities are certified in the history of Dachau, and then they are basically doing these tours each day. And it's obviously a very emotional experience for them, as it is for the visitors who go to a site like Dachau. And so we worked with them to do some interpretive training, approaches essentially the pedagogy of guiding, and essentially looked at ways to engage with visitors and to explore topics and some of the conflicts that they run into. So when I speak about tourism being on the front line of remembrance, this is one example where you have these guides that are dealing with a very, very difficult, very emotionally charged and traumatic story, conveying these stories on a day-to-day basis to visitors who are having a range of reactions, from highly charged emotionally themselves to ambivalence. And so guides are really doing a lot of memory work themselves. And as Oliver mentioned, the most recent documentary was Moral Awakening, which looked at the experience of the Delaunay people and the making of the atom bomb. The story involves the Port Radium site, where uranium came and was used in the Manhattan Project. So there's a site at moralawakening.ca which has that particular film. I'm just going to take us off to Vimy, and this is a place which is a very powerful place for a lot of Canadians, and it's also kind of the heart of our national mythology around the First World War. And one of the projects that I was engaged in a few years ago was to work with an agency called Education First Tours. They're based out of Switzerland, and they took on the task of taking the 10,000 Canadians, the Canadian youth, to France and to engage them in tours in the area. So we have a tour company basically in charge of a portion of the national commemoration. And the portion was this. This is an expo conference center in the town of Arras. And the question that was put forward to a group of academics, so there was people from the Department of Education at University of Toronto and myself, as well as others, is what should we do with 10,000 students when we go to France and commemorate? And how can we use this space to help with that? So the question around remembrance when we move on through the ages is one where we're talking about education and how we educate generations about the past. And we know that as time goes on, sites and the mythology and legend of these places changes, it gets reinterpreted, and this is what we could also call the politics of remembrance. And we've seen a range of different books over the past 10 years or so that have come out and spoken about Vimy in particular. So Richler's book had coined the term the Vimy Effect. Well, actually drew from General Hillier and spoke very charged about this idea of how we celebrate war. As he says here in this quote, when Canadians tell the story of the Battle of Vimy Ridge as a creation myth, they tell it in a manner that prompts complicity rather than outrage. And so we can see that when we get into remembrance and we look at commemoration, these are very, very difficult discussions to have to what are we remembering and how are we doing it. So that was the situation that we're stepping into when we're looking at Vimy. And I'm about to show you a documentary, but I wanted to start with this image, which is one that I'm working with right now. And it's of the first gas attack in 1915. So not to do with Vimy, but just the effort to capture the horror of war has been one of the great challenges with remembrance and commemoration. And I thought before we step into watching a film which was produced by Education First Tours, which is very glossy and very, I think it's quite a powerful 3-minute piece. I think we also need to always remind ourselves of this other side that we're trying to work with. These are Zouave and Turco troops that are basically have just been hit by the first gas attack on April 22nd, 1915. And it's an image we don't often see of, troops, particularly the colonial troops and the experience that they had. And so without belaboring the point, we can see that, we're always trying to understand what warfare is and the experience of it if we have not experienced it firsthand, which most of us have not. I happened to be a guide at Vimy Ridge long ago. I was really curious about working there, and because I had an interest in history, but I really understood when I was there the power of place. And when you layer a story over top of a landscape, the effect it can have on people. This was way back in 1990. And we were very much not trained. We were told the story of Vimy Ridge, and we conveyed a lot of the mythology that we've since rewritten, shall we say. But nevertheless, there was a lot of history I learned there, and it was a very interesting experience. One of the images that I always find when I think about Vimy, and I just mentioned this because it goes to show how we use memorials and how we create markers that try to reshape our perspective on war. And this is the famous Walter Allward sculpture that you find at the Memorial Park. And when he explained the allegory at the top of the memorial, he said that they were figures of truth, faith, justice, charity, knowledge, and peace, singing the hymn of peace. And he saw these as the virtues of Canada. And when I was as a young man telling the story of what these figures meant, and that this is what Canada represented, it was a very powerful moment. Of course, years later, as I reflected back on these, there's a lot of issues we can speak about. Of course, when this was constructed in the 1920s and 30s, we had residential schools that were in full swing, and we had a lot of different issues that were happening at that time. And so I would say that maybe this is something that we continue to strive to achieve as virtues. But really, these memorials go on and speak to us in different ways, and they constantly evolve in their meaning. So I think you all know the story Battle of Vimy Ridge, and it happened in 1917 in April. I won't go into that in great detail, but I thought I'd just show you this clip here. I'm going to turn over to a video which is about 3 minutes in length. This shows the experience of the April 9th, 2017, and then the following day when we worked at the expo site. So you're going to see a bit of both.
A century ago, as dawn broke over Vimy Ridge, the morning air suddenly exploded with an unholy roar. It was the sound of 15,000 Canadians surging into battle. Today, 100 years later, we honor their eternal sacrifice.
The events of that day saw the 4 divisions of the Canadian Corps serving together for the first time to take a stand against tyranny and oppression. This was Canada at its best. The Canadians at Vimy embodied the true North, strong and free.
Today, there are no remaining veterans of the First World War. That means it's up to us to remember and to honor their memory, lest we forget.
This trip has been very important to sort of remind both myself and other people, you know, just what it is to be Canadian.
It's strengthened my pride in my country and in my nationality as being Canadian.
I'm more aware and I am more appreciative of what has happened in history. It suddenly becomes something that we're grateful for and a piece of history that we take pride in.
You're seeing it through a different lens, right? You're seeing the ripple effect through the generations. Your worldview is challenged and it just affects you as a person. Like, you can't look at this and come back unchanged.
100 years later, as I look over the faces gathered here, I can't help but feel that a torch is being passed. Let us hold to the grace of the ones who stood by their country. This is why we're here, why we remember.
So that was the experience of organizing a commemoration to do with Vimy, and the intention was to create a past, present, and future structure, and basically to try to take the learnings of the experience of the First World War and what we learned from it, and bring it into the present day to talk about issues of empathy and understanding a range of the issues that we face today. So basically, you know, we try to use these opportunities of commemoration and remembrance to present day needs in a lot of ways, and these can be debated and they can be contested, but certainly this area is why I study. This is why I study this particular area. So when I'm talking about remembrance, I find myself working across a range of theories and concepts, and this is list is not complete by any means, but you can see we're dealing with a range of different areas, a lot to do with tourism and particularly around the anthropological perspective, but certainly we weave into cultural geography, memory studies, and these kinds of things, and history too, of course. And so this is a theoretical framework that I sometimes use where I think about cultural memories of war, you know, people's perspectives that they come into certain experiences, and then how we have issues such as the heritage force field, which is this idea of the views of management, locals, visitors, veterans, and how they contest how a museum should look, what should be in the museum, how the war should be represented. And also to the whole relationship between people visiting a site, and the meaning they draw from it. So these are the kinds of things that we will just touch on briefly here. And when we think about remembrance, we can really think about it from two perspectives. One is the public recollection, the act of public recollection, and this involves various rituals and traditions that we engage in every year. And certainly the Vimy experience was part of that national messaging. A second perspective is more of a personal one, and I tried to start that this presentation with that, the idea of these personal experiences that we have, this fictive kinship that we may have with our community, or if we're in a regiment, or with our neighbors, or these other elements that allow us to tie in with some of these stories. This is a gentleman named Olivier. He's in France. He's a local guide. He's very committed to a regiment called the Regina Rifles. This is their little memorial beside an industrial park. Most people have forgotten it. And so for him, he knows the veterans that were there long ago when they used to visit the site, and he tries to keep that particular memory alive. Jay Winter's done some really interesting work on Remembering War, a book that he wrote back in about 2006, and he talks about agents and acts of remembrance. And acts are things that people do as a recognition of commemoration, and then he talks about agents as those that are involved with managing and orchestrating aspects of remembrance. He also sees a difference between the veteran generation and then the post-veteran generation, and how acts evolve over time. From my perspective, I see remembrance as something that is multi-layered, and we can think of it as involving everything from general awareness to education to emotional remembering, a term that Geoffrey White at University of Hawaii coined. And then finally, this idea of transformative remembrance. And the research I do is really try to explore that experience of people walking across a battlefield and what goes on for them, how they relate to it, and what meaning they make of it. It can be national, it can be social, and it can also be about understanding thoughts around death. And so I generally think of it as looking like this, that remembrance days and war films are there, and they provide a degree of an act of remembrance, we could say, but something that is involving a trip to a particular battlefield is something that is quite different and quite powerful. And I think the EF Tour film, with the various voices that are brought in, tries to express that impact. But tourism's relationship with war memory is quite a checkered one, and we can see that it's certainly a big business. And this is something that, again, Jay Winter talks about. He refers to the whole business of remembrance side, and how we're looking at issues around commercialization and these kinds of things. We can even talk about terms like tourists versus pilgrims. And certainly long ago, when veterans would return, they would be on a pilgrimage. And nowadays, family members, when they're going to try to understand the experience of the past, try to also take that title up of being a pilgrim, and a secular pilgrim. But we don't even have to go too far. We can go back about 100 years to a poem written by a veteran of the First World War. And I won't read it here, but this one's called Highwood. And this particular poem really reflects the concern that Johnson was going to have with what he saw in the future of people coming to the battlefield and touring it as kind of a experience that is something that just a throwaway experience, that they just wander around, they really wouldn't be engaged, and someone would be profiting from it. And it's a very powerful poem in its own way. But Johnson, when he speaks about Highwood is one of the battles that you find in the Battle of the Somme. It was in October, November of 1916. And Highwood today is this. It's bushes. There's a couple markers in there, and very few people actually know the story of Highwood. So despite Johnson's concern that tourism would be destroying the memory of war and of what happened to those that died, we have a story here of Highwood that stands today as something that's generally forgotten. And we see this when we tour areas of France and elsewhere, where we take, we're hopping in our car and we're driving across the countryside and we see a cross in the distance, or we see a little cemetery. And it's filled with stories. This is called Quebec Cemetery, which is on the road to Cambrai and part of the 1918 offensive, where Canada lost, killed or wounded about 45,000 men over the course of 100 days. But a lot of these stories are lost. They're not the Vimy Ridge stories. They're stories that we set aside because there's only so many things we can remember. And so tourism has this really bizarre situation where it offers these really potent and powerful experiences for people that tour these sites, and yet is a commercial venture. And so it creates this sense of this dissonance that we're always dealing with. Now, when we actually look at how we define tourism, this can actually help us understand what this is all about. So we have a couple of definitions here I'll just quickly run through. This is the United Nations World Tourism Organization definition, which is a very simple definition, probably the most boring in the world, in the sense of expressing that tourism is essentially an activity of traveling to a place outside his or her usual environment for less than a specified period of time, and whose main purpose of travel is other than the exercise of an activity remunerated from within the place visited. They go on to say that a tourist is someone who travels for greater than 24 hours in a distance of 80 kilometers. So that kind of information allows us to quantify and provide a very positivist perspective on what tourism is. And we can see the kind of projected growth pre-COVID, and we can see the incredible drop that we've experienced during COVID. And we can see that the whole tourism industry, as it is focused on attracting tourists and selling experiences. Another definition allows us to look at it as both an economic and a social phenomenon. And this is really important because then when we're starting to look at things like this, we can see this quite differently. So this is an increase in visitor numbers between 2001 and 2019. And so we can see that, well, hotels probably did very well at this, wherever this is. But there's another story here. Is of course, these are the numbers of visitors to Auschwitz. And when we think about that, it went from about 500,000 in 2001 all the way over 2 million by 2019. We can say that something is going on there from a social perspective. And I often work with my students to think about, what has happened here? Why are so many people going there now, so many years afterwards? And there's a range of reasons. It's part of the legacy of families where people that were survivors take their grandkids and they'll go to the site. It is a pilgrimage for many people that are connected with the site in some way. And then there are those that are just want to know the history. So there's a range of reasons why these sites become important to study from a social phenomenon perspective. And finally, it's not really a definition, but one that I like to keep in mind is just that whole experience of the person. We kind of went from this global view, we go from a social and economic phenomenon perspective, and then we go into the whole thing of how people perceive the value of travel in their lives. A book written by Julia Harrison from Trent University. She was speaking to a lot of young people, and they would say things like, I think my life is totally established by traveling. Now that might be a bit of a reach, but in another way, obviously travel shapes who we are in a lot of ways. And so when we walk these battlefields, we have people working with their imagination, with their emotion, and basically trying to interpret place. I'll just move on here a little bit. So Keith Hollinshead uses a term, the grand cliche. And basically he says, there's a lot of things that we say about tourism that are really not quite proven, but they sit comfortably with us. And one of them might be that war remembrance would be better off without tourism, as it undermines remembrance. And so, despite issues of commercialism and despite these challenges we have with interpretation at sites, it is something that really is of value to remembrance and to extending our understanding of these places and of this history. I'm just watching my time, Oliver. How long would you like me to go for?
If you could wrap up in the next 5-8 minutes, that'd be great.
Okay, good. So obviously there's some challenges that we have to face when we're looking at tourism. And I do a lot of work when we're talking about managing sites. So I'll spend just a few more minutes just to speak to this. One idea, and I just mentioned Hollinshead's name, is he talks about the world-making element of tourism and how tourism, through its marketing, can create these false images of a destination. And that, and I'll let you read the definition there, it can basically favor certain representations of place. And so in that way, we have something that is very challenging for us to work with at times. When we think about world making, we need to have this idea of mediating agencies, those elements that are actually conveying messages to travelers. We have tour guides and museums, we have monuments, we have destination marketing organizations, and all these different elements, even guidebooks that are doing this. And essentially what we have is we often, when we're looking at tourism, we're looking at landscapes and monuments and food and these kinds of things. The visitor lens comes in, that cultural memory, their previous experiences, and we mediate that via management of sites, guides, these kinds of things to create this co-constructed experience. And so when we look at things like guidebooks, we can see that these can obviously create a lot of misinformation and challenges for people to understand the past. They're written with brevity in mind. Here's an example of an effort by a marketing agency in Normandy to focus on what they called the Mythic Sector, which just happened to be the American sector of the beach. So they were leaving out huge swaths of landscape where warfare occurred and which many argued needed to be remembered equally. We can talk about thanatourism, which is the whole study of visiting sites associated with death. It's not just simply stated that we use the same ideas and management approaches as we do for an amusement park, that we actually have to be understanding of this order of death. And so I will just leave it there because I just noticed our time is moving on. There's a range of other topics we could get into around identity and these kinds of things, but I'll just turn it over to you, Oliver. And if you like, I could bring up the Padlet site if people would like.
Sounds good. Thank you very much, Jeff. And indeed, what a rich presentation. And there are so many issues we could dive into. Could I ask those of you who would like to raise a question, if you could introduce yourself to Jeff, because he's not familiar with us. We don't really have the fortune of going around the table, of giving Jeff a sense of who we are, but it would be great if you bring up your question, that you introduce yourself very briefly. Who would like to start us off? I think, Jeff, you can stop your, okay. Oh, Cynthia, please.
Hi, good morning.
What? Great to see you, Cynthia.
Yeah, hi. Thank you so much for your presentation, Jeff. These your research intersects with questions that I myself am interested in. And one of the things I'm thinking about is, in regards to your presentation, is when does tourism and education work out negatively? So what happens when we have tourists going to places because they're attracted to the darkness of these sites, or they're paying pilgrimage to historical actors or facts that are not positive? So we know that we've seen a spike in thanatourism that pretty much coincides with what you see as the rise of visitors to places like Auschwitz. So how do we as teachers make sure that we're teaching in ways and not actually creating sites of thanatourism?
So
maybe Jeff, well, maybe you can think about it for a second. Cynthia, do you want to briefly introduce yourself?
Oh yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah. So I'm Cynthia Milton. I'm an historian of Latin America, and I work on questions of political conflict and remembrance of political conflict in Latin America. And I just recently joined UVic as the Associate Vice President Research, and I am a former fellow of the Center for Global Studies.
Nice to meet you, Cynthia.
Yeah.
So in the case of your studies, are you thinking that thanatourism is a negative thing and that we're trying to limit those sites?
So for instance, when tourists want to go to a place because they want to spend a night in a former prison, or they want to go to Tuol Sleng and take bones home with them, that kind of thing. That's one. But then we also have people going to places like Birkenau and saying, well, let's figure out what Hitler got wrong here so that we don't get it wrong again.
Yeah.
Right.
So, so I would say that these are the kinds of things that when we talk to the Dachau guides, for example, these are the kinds of issues that they run into often, where they're on that front line of these kinds of discussions where people are coming into site. Their conduct might not be appropriate.
Yeah.
And that's a loaded thing. Like, what is proper conduct when you go to these sites? Obviously, we want to see respectful behavior. But so there's a lot of discussion with guides as to how they need to essentially be guardians of this. They have to enforce, and they also have to tell these stories. And obviously, the whole hope is that we're going to come out at the other end with more of an empathetic, rich and meaningful understanding that helps us be better people in the world today. And so I think some sites really work at that. But obviously there's a group of tourists that are looking for those sites for ghoulish interests, and I do agree with you, they go to sites in order to support their own existing worldview. So transformative, when I say about transformative experience, it doesn't necessarily mean that they go, wow, I really believe in peace now. It sometimes means that it just reinforces their existing view. And that can be difficult. And that's why agencies like local destination marketing agencies and those kinds of things need to actually bring in controls around these sites. And, it shows that tourism can be an informal education, and it has a role to play in these negative forms of thanatourism. So issues around codes of conduct are really important in government agencies. Like in France, for example, a few years ago, they would have people arriving in Nazi uniforms and kind of reenacting France occupation. And of course, people were not supportive of that at all. And so that was made a law that you couldn't wear a uniform on the streets. Yeah. So there are examples where local governments and tourism agencies, they want to maintain a level of conduct and integrity that is not disrespectful.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Cynthia. Maddie, would you mind starting your camera or you're starting your mic and introducing yourself?
Hi. Thank you, Geoffrey, for your presentation. My name is Mehdi. I am a PhD candidate in the Political Science Department, working on forced migration. But I'm interested in your work and your research because growing up in Iran, I remember still that when I was very young, there were missiles coming to Tehran. And as a kid, I I could feel the horrors of war. This might be a bit of a different direction from your work, but I understand that most of your work is focused on tourism industry, private organizations, grassroots, and individual kind of works. But my question is about the role the states play, because especially in the case of Iran, how many years? It's been almost 40 years since the start of the war in 1980, I believe. And the government is still using the memories of war in their advantage. So once in a while, when there is an unrest in the country, all of a sudden they find some bodies of people who died in the war, and they have these public sort of funerals, and they have been actively for years having these tours to front lines close to the Iraqi borders, and they're promoting this idea of pilgrimage, and also they're bringing some of the bodies and they're burying them in city centers, and promoting them as martyrs. And I was wondering, what is your take on the role that states, for example, an authoritarian regime like the Iranian state plays out in your work? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, and I think the thing is all the examples I've been using, I focused on the world wars, things that are 100 years old, things that are 70 years old, and particularly with the Second World War, there's a certain justness that we can argue there. But a lot of peripheral wars, right? Wars that have happened that are massively impactful with a certain region in the world have a different, memory and a different form of remembrance and commemoration. And certainly, as you say, that governments can use these wars as a way to justify present actions, or to build a sense of what national identity is, and create memorials that are stating certain things that they want the people to believe. And so these are very challenging things. Moss wrote a book, Fallen Soldiers, where he talks about the cult of the fallen and myth of the war experience. And it's basically who gets to tell the story of what happened. And so when I show the image of a private tour company organizing a trip for 10,000 students from Canada, one question is, well, where was the Canadian government? And part of it was the Canadian government did not want to get too close to organizing commemorations. And so there can be a sensitivity where people say, we're not going to go there because we're going to get ourselves stuck. And other people say, we are going to go there because we need this story. And I mean, if you look at presidential speeches in Normandy, Ronald Reagan and Barack Obama and Clinton, they use the backdrop of Normandy to state a new American policy, foreign policy often. And so obviously the states use war memory to their own advantage in different ways. And I think it is challenging in the case of places like Iran. I mean, a lot of what I say has to be put through that filter and readapted to that context. What we're seeing right now, for example, in Turkey, is that political parties are providing funding for people to visit Gallipoli. And really, that was something that Australians and New Zealanders went to visit because it was part of their national war narrative. But Turkey has since, in the past 10 to 20 years, adopted that and are using it to their own political gain. So I think that's what's really intriguing about tourism, is that it does become this area of conflict in terms of how we think about memory, who manages a site, and what we're trying to use these sites for. So,
thank you very much. Cindy, you're next.
Hi, Geoffrey. Thank you so much for that really interesting presentation. I am a PhD candidate in the psychology department, really interested in culture and identity as well. And I was really struck by your comments about the opportunity for all these students to go to these sites and the different perspective of sites of war memory, and especially second perspective around a unique and individual meaning-making process. And I was wondering if you could speak more to that in terms of what you think, besides the empathy that you alluded to, what else a student might have walked away with and the range of different kinds of experiences.
Yeah, that's the concept. So that is a good question, Cindy, because one of the issues is often when do we ask students about what meaning have they made from a place? And so what I try to do is I do a pre-trip, I observe them during, so I'm not interfering, and then afterwards I talk to them. And what I find over time is the consequence of these experiences can be anything from wanting to learn more, take a history course or some kind of issue around some study that relates to what they've seen. It could be around volunteering more in the community. There are some that see it as an opportunity where they say, yeah, I want to join the military. There are other people that reinforces their view of the need for peace and that they want to focus on that more. So what I find is that it does create a sense of renewed focus and purpose for people, as travel sometimes does. When we have an educational element to travel, it can inspire us to do something. And so I find, not with everyone, but I'm finding with a number of people that it shapes, not just from a national perspective, but it could just be about wanting to give themselves to public service in their community by volunteering. So I think that's really something that can come of it. But I should mention that this whole thing around how it informs people's sense of identity, it tends to reinforce where they're standing politically, I think. So there's lots to be studied there, I think.
Thank you so much for that insight.
Could I follow up from Cindy's question here? Because I've also thought about how do you do this methodologically in conducting your research? Because on the one hand, you have the people who walk on those fields, who go there physically and have their reaction. It was fascinating to see your picture from 1990 or so when you were sent in, to be a guide, right? And your reaction. So how this plays out as a site, right? The physical presence in those sites of memory. And on the other hand, you describe the politics of memory, how mostly national agents try to, in a way, appropriate or use these sites also for political purposes. So in a way, two very different levels of analysis, trying to understand what happens at these places of commemoration. I'm just wondering, how can you bring those together? Do you, for example, if you reflect back, I think you briefly mentioned in your presentation that when you went there, you simply repeated what was fed to you, right? You picked up on the official narrative, and that's what you reproduced for the visitors there, as a young guide, right? But that's pretty normal. But I'm just wondering, how, or whether you found that these sites trigger also forms of learning that might critically question, the dominant narrative, right? That something unintended by those sites, happens in terms of looking at history. I'm just wondering how you, methodologically bring these two levels together, and then what you've learned about sometimes when these two narratives clash, right? What happens then with the visitors, and then how does it play out in terms of the impact on those people visiting?
There's a lot of ideas there. When I go over to Europe and I have my students with me, and when I was with this Education First group, I took some teachers around. And what I often noticed, for example, when we would go to, say, a cemetery, is we would all go around the cemetery, we'd come back into the bus, And then people would be talking about sports or interior design or something completely nothing to do with what the experience we're having. And at first I was a little bit put off. I thought, well, you're not focusing on what we're doing here. And I realized that people were just hitting a point where they were saturated, that they're meditating on death to a point where they simply needed to break free of it for a period of time to allow themselves to just, gain some energy to go back to it. And I think about going to the killing fields in Cambodia with students and just that whole thing of just letting people loose and then coming back a day later to talk about it. Right. And I think that's a really interesting issue from a pedagogical standpoint about the experiences people have and the chance to give for digestion before we actually discuss further. And I do think we see conflict in, where a narrative is put forward, okay, this is what we want you to believe, and then there's a pushback. And a lot of sites have really focused. So for example, in Normandy, the American Battle Monuments Commission has actively pursued a travel abroad program to American cemeteries overseas. They handed over responsibility for interpretation and visitor centers to the US Park Service. So they're storytellers, and they have focused in the past. One of the great controversies they engaged in was at Pearl Harbor, when the message in the 60s was, the moral of this story is be prepared. They changed that, and they took that out when they started to do their interpretation, to the chagrin of a lot of veterans and politicians who said that's what we should use this story for. So so it's interesting to your question about the conflict between when you go to a place and what people think. There's lots of moving parts, and there's certain elements when I go to Dachau, for example, that I can't link to. So the Dachau committee, I don't have access to that. The management is very closed, but the guides are open, right? So there's certain discussions that it's not an open, transparent setting where these discussions occur. And positions are taken that are really hard to negotiate at times. And I could go on and on. I mean, for example, there were gays that were kept at Dachau, and when they built the memorial, there was no recognition of that. It wasn't until the Lutheran Church put in a memorial in their chapel that acknowledged that. Mm-hmm. So, those are that was designed by survivors. So, and that was designed in the 60s. Right. So there's all these kinds of issues that you're dealing with at that level. Yeah.
Fascinating. Who would like to join us next? Let's see, I'll take my chat here. No reason to be shy. Sorry, that was wrong. Megan, please.
Hi, Geoffrey. My name is Megan Swift. I'm in Germanic and Slavic studies, and specifically a Russian scholar. And when I was listening to your talk, thank you very much for that. I was struck by the Vimy centenary, that the 1917 to 2017 was occurring at the exact same time as the centenary of the Russian Revolution, which had some very problematic memorialization around it. And finally, Putin finally used the date to erect the very first ever state-sponsored monument to the victims of political repression, so the victims of Stalinism. But what I was thinking about, what I wanted to ask you about, was about just in looking at those slides of the Vimy monument, and thinking about comparison with that downtown Moscow monument to the victims of political repression, was just the idea of the intentionality of the tourist. So for instance, a place like Vimy, which is this very wide rural space, very beautiful, very green and pastoral, a person chooses to go there, right? It's like a pilgrimage site. There's an intentionality there. But then there's a whole different level of sites of memorialization, which are And you see this a lot with Holocaust memorials. And in our department, we have a master's in Holocaust studies. So I supervise quite a few graduate students that are doing Holocaust studies. There's a whole other level of these urban memorialization sites where a person might just be going to the grocery store and they are struck by these memorial sites, even to the point of, you probably know about in Germany, they have these Stolpersteine memorializations for victims of the Holocaust, where you're literally, it's an obstruction. Like you're literally forced to stop and stumble. They're called stumbling stones to memorialize these events of the past. So I guess my question is, do you think that the level of intentionality has an effect on how people relate to these sites? Like, can memory actually be forced on people? Can a narrative actually be forced onto like an interpreting public, I guess?
Yeah, it's a really great question, because some of the slides I had in the deck were around this idea of remembering well. So what are we trying to achieve? When do we cross the finish line to say, I've remembered, right? Period. I've done that, and for this year, and I can move on. So how much remembering and commemoration do we need to do on a day-to-day basis? And it does become something that can be forced, right? And often these public acts are very vocal, and they're about congregating, and they're about hymns and music and poetry and wreath laying, whereas the more powerful is the personal internal experience we each have, and how we link to those stories. And so I don't think you can force it. I think it's about these traditions and protocols that bring people together, and therefore it's an act of kind of a national act or a community act. And then there's those personal things. And there is that whole thing of monuments hidden in plain sight, where, you know, you can go to some of these towns in Europe, and they'll have a little spot, like in one town I was at, there's an old parking lot, and they hang all the old memorials in there because they get so many plaques brought to them. And areas like Normandy, their count was something like 1,000 memorial markers, because people would come and they say, my granddad fought here and I want to build a memorial, or I want to build a museum because I have a lot of money. And they were just saying, thank you, but we've got enough. But when the state tries to force remembrance, I just wonder exactly what are they trying to achieve. And I think it goes to one of the earlier questions about the experience in Iran. I'm not sure if I approached your question with any sound response, but I think it's a really interesting one around focusing on this idea of remembering well, and why we're remembering, and to what end.
Thank you. I think you did answer that well.
Thank you, Megan. Just before I hand it over to Angie, a quick note here that I spent quite a bit of time in Ukraine, and it was really mind-boggling how, you know, the collective memory was changed almost, you know, the national narrative from one day to the other, and all these sites of commemoration had to be in a way redesigned, and, you know, a whole new idea of what national identity and, you know, things to remember in the past were. And it was a very deliberate way of doing this. And you just wonder, right, you know, if you've gone through the same kind of site of commemoration for generations, and now for once, you know, no, that's no longer valid. We have something very different here for you to remember. It was, you know, exercise in, you know, shifting, you know, the focus on this memory from one day to the other, right? And you know, I think I'm sure there are books, you know, already written on this, but
absolutely, Oliver. In Eastern Europe, you need to be such a skilled reader, like an interpreter. The hermeneutic challenge of going through these sites is like really high level.
I know, partly because the narrative is changing so quickly. So thanks. Angie.
Hi, Geoffrey. Thank you for your talk. I'm Angie Chow. I'm in Pacific and Asian Studies, and I actually have a graduate student who's working on Cultural Revolution memoirs. So I was really interested in seeing that slide where you had the distinction between, I think it was like theater of remembrance and acts of remembrance. And but my question is actually about technology and the pandemic. And I guess I'm just thinking that now, you know, since we can't be traveling in person to a lot of these sites of tourism, I've seen work being done on kind of like virtual reality and other ways of getting people who don't have access to travel to go to these kinds of tourist sites of commemoration. And I'm just curious what your thoughts are on that, if there's something about, you know, having to be in that physical space or site of commemoration, or if you think there's a possibility for some sort of technology to recreate like a similar experience. So thank you.
Thanks, Angie. That is something that I have colleagues who are working on virtual reality, and you know, you can stand in a battlefield and you can look around and you can experience it that way as one form of technology. And I'll mention one that I think that works and one that doesn't. So in the case of virtual reality, I think there's a whole thing around time and space, and that whole thing of time travel, where we can't be there in time, but we can travel to the space where that happened, and we find a sense of connectivity with it, and we can touch things. And I found that a lot of this, when I asked students, you know, what did you find significant about your time there? They said, well, I could touch the ground, or I could touch something. And so I think there's a whole lot that's going on psychologically with people when they're in a place. And often this is seen as kind of a male thing where, you know, guys like war and therefore they're buffs and they want to go to a battlefield. And I found that not to be the case. I found that people that didn't have experience with it were drawn in different ways and wanted to talk about it in different ways when they went to a place. So in terms of, but it was all about being there and connecting with it in terms of the link between time and space. So I think that is an important element that technology can't necessarily fulfill. But one of the notes I put up was around a guy named Berger Stickelbach, and he's a digital archaeologist based in at Ghent University. And he does work where he takes aerial trench imagery and he places it onto an app, which allows you to move from 1915 to present day. And I think that changes our understanding and our relationship to the landscape. And that kind of technology really opens up our interpretation. I even find using drone imagery, because we've always looked at things either in black and white or at that level. When we have drones, it changes our perspective of the landscape, and it allows us to see things in a new way and reveals some things. So that I find that those technologies are really interesting, like this whole side of the digital archaeology, and even drone imagery is really quite a useful way to open the discussion in a new way. So hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that sounds very promising. So thank you.
We are getting close to the point where we stop the official part of the session, then have another 10 minutes where we can hang out, you know, so to speak. So maybe it's a good time to thank Jeff very much for his mesmerizing presentation, and you know, doing us in such short-term notice, introducing us to your field of research. And you could already probably feel that there are some interesting overlaps for, you know, for people with our community, and hopefully we can draw you in at some stage a bit also physically to introduce our space here at the Center for Global Studies. But it's been great to be introduced to you this way, Jeff, and thank you again for taking the time to prepare such a presentation for us.